Welcome back to day 2 of City and Financial Global's EV Infrastructure Summit 2020. I hope that you enjoyed yesterday's proceedings. Today we have another packed agenda with great speakers and some very interesting topics. These include sessions on using EV adoption by fleets as a way of catalysing take-up by consumers, on how ready the UK is to accommodate a fleet of 10 million vehicles, on supply chain and security of supply, as well as market opportunities, on the state of EV innovation and using the technology for trucks and other forms of transport, on the role of energy networks, on the latest battery chemistries and their potential, on financing the scale of EV charging infra, and on the grid market impact of EV charging and V2G. Turning to our technology platform, please do take advantage of its networking capabilities by using the networking button on the left of your screen to meet your fellow participants, or if there is someone specific you would like to meet, why not invite them to a private video chat? Just click on their name in the list under the People button on the right of your screen and follow the instructions. And in the breaks, our sponsors would really like you to visit their booths and interact with them. These can be found in the expo area on the left of your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Ben Foulser, our chair for today, and Alex Harrison, who will be giving this morning's opening remarks. Ben is a director and leads KPMG's Future Mobility team, providing consultancy services to clients spanning zero-emission mobility, intelligent transport, smart ticketing fare payment systems, mobility as a service, connected and autonomous vehicle technologies, demand-responsive transport, and command and control, including traffic management and signaling. Ben's work spans the transport and mobility services industry and includes both public and private sector clients. He has a significant experience working with central and devolved government, infrastructure authorities, and major metropolitan transportation authorities around the globe. Turning to Alex, Alex is an energy partner at Hogan Lovells. He advises clients on power generation, greenfield and brownfield project development, project and structured financing, electricity regulation, electricity and emissions trading, and acquisitions and disposals across the renewables, low carbon and thermal power sectors. He has worked on coal, gas, LNG to power, carbon capture and storage, nuclear, wind, solar, biomass, hydro and energy storage transactions. Alex also advises clients in relation to energy transition, aggregation and digitalization issues, on EV charging and the electrification of transport and heat, and on the development, financing and regulation of grid network infrastructure assets. Alex, over to you.
Maurice, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes just giving you a personal perspective on EV charging. It's become a bit of a passion area, a passion project for me. I'm married to, have been married to the co-head of the Office of Low Emission Vehicles, leading UK government policy in this area. So it's a bit of a passion project in our home and something that we're keen on. What I'd like to do is just share some perspectives on the market based on the work that I've been exposed to date. And a little bit about what I think we know and what I think we don't know about the shape of the market and how it's likely to develop. So as a starting point, I think there are different projections depending on what you look at, but one that I've seen that I quite like is a projection that there'll be more than 120 million EVs in one form or another, whether full battery or plug-in, on the roads in UK, Asia and the USA by 2030. It's clear that what's going to be needed to support those electric vehicles is a network of millions of charge points and a smart new ecosystem that manages the impact of that charging demand on the electricity networks to which it's connected, particularly at times of system peak. What we don't know is quite how the pace of that EV uptake is going to unfold, and it's influenced by a huge range of factors, including national government policies, particularly those in support of the transition to low emission or zero emission vehicles, but also by broader decarbonisation targets. Equally influenced by the length of time it takes for EVs to reach price parity with traditional ICE engine vehicles, because that is a key tipping point in terms of the consumer decision whether to switch. And beyond that, we know that consumers still have anxiety about vehicle range. and there are perceptions that EVs are not yet suitable for longer journeys in some circumstances, and that's partly down to the availability of public charging at stations, rapid fast charging solutions, and perception about a lack of infrastructure, I think, is acting as an impediment in part to people switching and moving across to an electric vehicle and transitioning. We also don't know quite what our charging ecosystem is going to look like to support these vehicles, and there are kind of two parts to that: the speed of the system in terms of what combination of slow, fast, rapid, ultra rapid / high powered charging we're going to need to support that those millions of vehicles. And we don't know exactly where we're going to charge in terms of the proportion of our charging that's likely to be at home or at work, at the various destinations where we travel to, or somehow en route as we're moving between places. So the exact scope of the system that's going to be needed, I mean, the number of vehicles and when they're going to come and the scope of the system that's needed to support them is a key uncertainty. And lots of forecasts assume that a large amount or a very large amount of charging will take place at home, shifting from the kind of en route system that we have for traditional fueling at the moment. But I think it's key to note that the charging hierarchy, the optimal charging footprint, is going to depend on, is going to vary from country to country. It is going to vary within countries from cities to rural areas, and it's going to be particularly influenced by residential access to off-street parking and whether or not people commute by car in those locations to work, and whether or not they have parking locations that can be fitted with charging at those work and destination locations. So you've got key variables that differ from location to location just in terms of the status quo, but the charging system that we're thinking about and planning today also needs to take account of the changing ways in which we are using mobility. So the move to ride sharing, which presumes, I think, that levels of personal car ownership may reduce, and mobility will become more of a service, with each of us accessing somebody else's vehicle for our journey and so on. And in addition to that, we've got in the slightly longer term horizon the anticipated shift to AV, to autonomous vehicles. And in both cases, looking at those trends, it's likely that the mileage per vehicle and therefore the demand for charging is going to significantly increase compared to a domestic vehicle that, you know, some forecasts would suggest spends more than 90% of its life sat parked and unused. A ride-sharing service or an autonomous vehicle is likely to have a much higher usage profile, a very different charging profile, therefore, and therefore the locations at which those vehicles will optimally charge and the speeds at which they'll need to charge in order to continue to provide those services will change. So what can we learn from that? Well, it's pretty clear that a variety of different EV charging solutions are going to be needed, and the business and revenue models that support those solutions are going to differ depending on speed and location. In particular, I think the ancillary revenues, the revenues that go beyond the sale of the pure power, will differ depending on the duration of the charging point and its location, and what customers may or may not be able to be enticed into spending their money on in the period while they're charging. We also have a potentially very exciting market for providing power and flexibility from vehicles to the grid or to somewhere else, principally to corporates, to businesses, to people's homes. And so bi-directional power flow from the vehicles, using the vehicles as effectively an aggregated battery solution to provide some level of capacity to the grid or flexibility to the grid in terms of frequency response or other services. There's huge and very exciting potential for that to become a major market and additional source of revenue. But what's uncertain is the exact role that kind of aggregation of vehicle batteries could play, both in servicing the grid, but also in providing wider kind of energy as a service and flexibility services, perhaps behind the meter or to businesses and to homes. And we also have a kind of core uncertainty around quite what the effect of providing that bi-directional flow will be on the lifespan of vehicle batteries and so on. So a potentially very exciting market, but some uncertainty as to how it's likely to develop. What can we say? In my view, the EV charging market is likely to consolidate. There are a large number of players developing solutions at the moment, and one imagines that some will go on to succeed and some may fall by the wayside. And it's likely to be driven by how robust the sort of technology, cost, revenue, cash flow, and growth story those businesses can sell. Access to capital is going to be key to finance the scaling and the growth of this market. Where that capital is going to come from is uncertain, but it's likely to be from a range of different sources: energy, automotive and tech majors potentially, but also from traditional private equity, venture capital, project finance, structured finance, and other kind of equity and debt solutions. And one of the key things that needs to be managed here is and understood here is exposure to the risks that these projects will inevitably have. And one of the biggest risks is demand risk. In almost all cases, there is some level of demand risk or demand uncertainty in relation to the need for charging here. And so early projects are likely to focus on solutions that can manage that demand risk best. For example, hub solutions or solutions with fleets or similar. I'll end by saying it seems pretty clear to me that EV charging and the related kind of energy as a service solutions are emerging as a new asset class. But as I think we've been discussing, there is no one size fits all. The risk profile and the structures will vary from solution to solution, and success will therefore come in different forms. And so what's going to be key is the ability to build a loyal customer base or to otherwise have an underpinning of demand, and to try to monetize revenue streams over and above the sale of power in order to build a more solid revenue stack to support the economics of the business. I think all of us in the UK market as a whole can play a key role in delivering that, not just for the UK, but also structuring solutions that can be applied globally. And so it's a very exciting place that we find ourselves within this global marketplace. And with that, I'll hand back to Ben.
Alex, thank you, and thank you for a great introductory speech. I think it really sets the scene for the day and covers a wide range of topics. I'd like to ask Philip to turn his webcam on and unmute, and what we'll do is we'll just take a quick break, quick pause while we just switch over the speakers, and then we'll start again in just a second with Philip's keynote address. And welcome back. We now have Philip New, who's going to give us our keynote address on Towards a Charging Infrastructure that Works for the Consumer, System and Energy Transition. Philip is the Chief Executive Officer of Energy Systems Catapult and Chair of the Electric Vehicle Energy Taskforce. The Energy Systems Catapult was established in April 2015 with a remit to support the transition of the UK energy system and enable economic growth from the many commercial and technological opportunities that will be created as the way we make, distribute and use energy undergoes radical change over the coming decades. The scope includes the interaction of energy with adjacent sectors, including water and transport. Philip is a commissioner on the Global Energy Transition Commission and a member of the Global Futures Council of the World Economic Forum. He's also a fellow of the Energy Institute and sits on advisory panels. Before joining the Catapult, Philip worked for BP for over 30 years in a range of commercial and general management positions, mostly in customer-facing businesses operating in Asia, North and South America, and Europe. Philip has an MA in Philosophy, Politics and Economics from Oxford University and lives in Oxford, UK with his wife, his 3 children, now at university. Philip, I think we're in capable hands. Over to you.
Ben, thank you very much indeed. So over the next few minutes, what I've been charged with doing is reviewing the work so far of the EV Energy Taskforce, and then getting into where we go from here, what the next steps are. So if we could move on to the first slide, please, on the next slide, please. Thank you. I think Alex's framing actually set the scene fabulously for what the EV Task Force, or much of what the EV Task Force was asked to focus on when it was originally established by BEIS and DFT to key UK government departments. And the terms of reference that we had are represented here. I'm not going to read through them, but I think what is clear is the focus that was put by the people that designed and set up the task force on making sure that it's all about the engagement of EV users. The consumer is at the heart of the work of the task force. There are a bunch of ancillary objectives, which sometimes caused us some debate as to how we prioritize things, but the essence of the message here is what needs to happen to enable an EV infrastructure, charging infrastructure, to emerge in the UK that really enables the EV user to have as good an experience as possible. So what was in scope were the items on the left-hand side, and what was out of scope are the things on the right. So we weren't the EV task force. We weren't looking at every aspect of the range of challenges and uncertainties that Alex went through. So we're not about forecasting. We're not about the deployment of charge points, the physical specification of charge points. We weren't there to define standards, and dumb charging was not on. We were about the things on the left-hand side of the chart, the green column. What was important, really important, about the task force, and perhaps the most important thing about it, was the fact that I'm told for the first time we were able to get multiple actors from the many diverse sectors that are engaged in this wholly new industry together in one room. So of course we had the diverse players across the energy sector, suppliers, network operators, generators. But we also had the auto sector strongly represented. The charging, the new charging industry, the retailers were present. We had representatives from digital and people who were concerned with the built environment and the evolution of the built environment. And critically, we had representatives of consumer bodies there. We engaged with hundreds of companies. I think in the end, over 300 individual companies actively engaged in the work of the task force. And so it was a real melting pot to try and bring together the diverse interests and approaches of multiple stakeholders. If we could move to the next slide, please. So, given the diversity of the actors that were involved, the people that were around the table, which incidentally, I mean, for the first few months, it was clear that we just had language issues, that people in energy, from an energy background, would put a completely different meaning on a relatively common technical word or phrase than people from automotive, for example. So we had to sort of find the common language, but critically, we had to identify some core, common, shared principles that would guide the work and enable us to have a true north that we could align around when there were the inevitable differences of view as different sectors, different representatives played out their own particular interests. Key, as I've already indicated, was that we aimed for the best consumer outcome. We were really concerned to make sure that the energy system is not perceived as a blocker to EV uptake, indeed, that it should be seen as an enabler of EV uptake. The huge opportunity here is for the first time to incorporate the transport system into the energy system in a way that enables better outcomes for both, lower costs and better utilization better utility. And that was a key principle that we tried to push. One of the most difficult things was getting the balance right around supporting innovation and participation in the activity set. Sometimes it's very easy, particularly if you've got a lot of engineers in the room, for people to be taking a safety first view and worrying about every single risk, and then trying to put rules in place to mitigate those risks. That can be quite compelling, but it has it itself contains risk because, of course, an abundance of caution can start to stifle the scope for innovation. On the other hand, if you're completely laissez-faire, you sometimes end up with some really rather unpleasant unintended consequences. And so getting the balance right, getting the Goldilocks moment, finding the Goldilocks point between those two stresses was something that stayed with us through the whole process. We were very concerned about equity and social impacts. There is scope for EV charging to evolve in a way that could be quite divisive, could benefit some groups of society rather than others, could exclude some groups of society from the democratization of mobility that has been such a feature of the 20th century. So we were worried about that, and we absolutely wanted to make sure that we were taking a whole systems view that was looking over multiple timeframes, not just the short term, and definitely not just a sort of a long-term aspiration, but something that could give us a pathway through to the future. So after a year and a half of intense work, if we can move to the next slide, please. And yeah, great. After a year and a half of intense work, the task force came up with 21 specific clear proposals aimed both at government and at industry. They fell under the 5 key themes that you can see here. So the first, interoperability. It was something that I think was widely shared across the group, that what we need to aspire to is an infrastructure that enables people to charge their car with the same utility, the same convenience, the same, without needing to give it any particular thought as they can today, fill their car with petrol. The second was, smart charging, as Alex hinted at, has got some really great benefits to bring. It is going to be critical if we can minimize cost and release economic value. But we need to think about how consumers are better rewarded for that, so that there is a real incentive for consumers or the service provider that was working on behalf of consumers to charge at a time that gives the best benefit to the system as a whole and rewards them. Data, it became very clear, was the critical linchpin behind the whole thing. The work of the Energy Data Task Force was very important in helping frame the thinking in the EV task force about what needs to happen to data, how it's to be best used and to be best protected if it's going to support the outcomes we were seeking. But the ED task force, while it's great, was looking at a specific sort of strand of the electricity sector overall. And of course, we were starting to wrestle with problems here around how data might best be shared and used between energy networks on the one hand, consumers, smart appliances in the home, and of course, vehicles. So that became and remains a really fundamental area of focus and activity for the task force. There's a lot more we need to do to inform customers and EV drivers, to win their trust, to win their confidence, to make it easier for them to engage with this new market with all of these uncertainties. And so there was a big focus on what needs to happen to support those mechanisms. And finally, we thought that there was and there remains a gap in how infrastructure is designed and implemented and maintained in particularly cities and towns across the country. So what needs to happen to reinforce the capability of our places in making sure that we have the infrastructure in the right place, set up so that it's future-proofed and works for people. If we could move on, please. So 3 key priorities then. The first let's really make sure that smart charging comes through and is a fundamental characteristic of the way that we charge our vehicles in the future. Let's make sure that we've got resilience in the system, that we've got security of the data around it, but let's make sure as well that we've got the market mechanisms set up to enable appropriate incentives to be, the benefits to be shared with consumers, so they are incentivized to take advantage of smart charging opportunities. The second, if we're going to have an interoperable system, there is more work that needs to be done on developing common standards and common codes of practice. And so that became a really big piece. And then, as I've already intimated, the last priority, much more effective planning, planning that incorporates and coordinates what's happening with network structures and with with town planning. So that was launched and published in January. It feels like a long time ago now. The interesting thing is that we have been asked to continue with the EV task force. So we are shortly to announce the launch of EVET 2.0. And I'll just very quickly talk to what we're going to be doing with EVET 2.0. If you can go on to the next slide, please. So what was clear is that the people who participated in EVET 1 really enjoyed the fact that it provided a safe space to bring together diverse interests. So there is a need, a role for EVET 2 in maintaining its convening role across the community as a whole. What was also clear is that having made some proposals, there's a need to put them into action. And so there was an expectation on the EV task force to help support and push that, and as part of that, to monitor our progress and to keep an eye on where we're going. And so they are the three prime roles of EVET 2. If we can move to the next one, please. Because what was clear is that, and the good news is, there's been a lot of activity in government, but also across the private sector, in taking forward many of the themes that were established and proposals were established in EVET 1. So we were very concerned to make sure that any new work that EVET did was properly additional and filled gaps. So we went through a triaging process, making sure that trying to understand what the state of play was, and to make sure that what EVET does in the future in terms of specific actions is appropriately focused. And so I'll just quickly run through the key priorities before wrapping. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So the areas of priority, we still think there is more that needs to be done around supporting and enabling stronger and better and more universal consumer engagement. There is a lot more we think that needs to happen to support better and stronger and more integrated transport and energy planning in places. There is more to be done around data access, privacy, and sharing. And we, although there is much already going on here and some really good work happening, we think there is some support needed around how we close the remaining gaps that there might be around smart charging and cybersecurity. So they are the areas that we're focusing on in EVET 2. How we will do that is on the next slide. And so in some cases where we don't think that there is a body at the moment that's able to do the work that we've identified, we'll define the scope and we'll suggest a body or the body or bodies that might be capable of delivering the action. There are situations where we've already got, activities underway and groups doing a fine job, and so there is a potential there for the EVET community simply to provide their support and help to that body. Obviously, we're going to continue to interact closely with both policymakers and the regulator. There are a few areas where we think there is still significant work to be done, and where new money needs to be found, new resource needs to be found to enable new work to be delivered. And we will be working on developing business cases for those particular interventions. And then finally, of course, we're going to establish and then report back on the progress in delivering the actions and the proposals that were identified in the original report. And so what this is, I suppose it's important here to say, EVET is not itself a delivery body. What we're trying to do here is enable, support, define the actions for others to take forward in service of the proposals that were identified and established in the original report. And then if we could conclude with the final slide, please. If you would like to know more about this, we will be launching EVET 2 on October the 22nd. It'll be an online event. There'll be a ministerial presence. It'll be, as it says here, a half-day seminar. It'll provide you with an opportunity to engage, learn much more about what's behind the whistle-stop tour that I've given you now. And obviously what I'm really hoping is that if you want to be able to participate, contribute, bring your voice to the table as we try and tackle the next wave of issues and opportunities that we see here, then this is a great way of engaging and enrolling. So if you want more information on this, that's the website to go to. And with that, thank you very much.
Philip, thank you ever so much for a very comprehensive run through of the EVET and indeed your plans for EVET 2. I can personally say, having engaged with the EV Energy Taskforce during some recent work for OLEV, what a constructive and helpful forum it is for educating and influencing the decisions for industry and for policy. So thank you for that. Stay tuned, please, while we just have a quick reshuffle for the panel session. We're going to take a very, very quick break and we're back in just 2 seconds. And welcome back to the EV Infrastructure Summit Day 2. We're now on the keynote panel with a fantastic selection of people who I'll let Christopher introduce in a second. I say that because it also includes me, a bit of modesty there. But effectively, we've got a wonderful panel discussing fleet transition and whether EV fleets make sense and what do we need to do to support the transition to EV fleets. Moderating and chairing our panel today is Christopher Hook, Clean Air Lead and Head of Vehicles for UK and Ireland for Uber. Christopher is Uber's UKI Clean Air Lead. This means he's responsible for Uber's ambition to be 100% electric in London by 2025 and helping to scale up sustainability efforts across the UK and beyond. This includes helping shape Uber's plan to be zero emissions by 2040. He sits on the Global Action Plan's Business Clean Air Taskforce and regularly engages with government, regulators, NGOs and other companies about how to encourage more sustainable transport. Prior to joining Uber in 2019, Christopher spent 10 years as sustainability strategy consultant at Accenture, culminating in leading Accenture's sustainable finance practice. During this time, he worked closely with Accenture development partnerships, applying his knowledge of sustainability to support large NGOs and development organisations. Chris, great to have you here, and thank you for moderating today's panel.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for the introduction. As Ben said, very lucky to have a group here to talk about EV fleets and the important role I think we all know fleets will play in this transition. Ben is one of our panelists, so unless you've just joined us, you've already heard lots about all the fantastic work that Ben does at KPMG. But in case you have just joined, Ben is a director in their infrastructure advisory group, works across sectors to really help governments and the private sector think about the future of infrastructure. We've also got two other panelists with us. We have André from Bloemendal, who is a VP of sales for ChargePoint in Europe. André is charged with leading ChargePoint's sales strategy and strategic partnerships across the whole of the European market. And he was before that the Chief Commercial Officer at New Motion, and will hopefully give us fantastic insights into the world of EV infrastructure and all of the great work that ChargePoint is doing. And we also have Arun Anand, who is CEO and founder of Electric Miles, who are doing some really innovative and interesting work around the Internet of Energy, and thinking about some of the software solutions that can really help with this transition. So before we get into the discussion, Andre's just going to give us a bit of an overview of his perspective and the work that he's doing, and then we'll hopefully have a useful chat about the role that we think EV fleets can play, some of the challenges and opportunities that they pose. So over to you, André.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Just checking, double checking. I had 1.5 hours, I think, to do the introduction. Right?
No, that's not André.
No, not this time. Okay, no. Jokes aside, guys. This whole EV transition. It's interesting that a lot of people talk about it. We had some very interesting insight already this morning. But I would like to spend 2 minutes or so on what this EV stands for and what we transition in fact. Because factually, what we do is we change the drivetrain of a lot of mobility vehicles, be it vans, be it passenger cars, be it trucks, be it middle mile, be it anything. And people start talking about this as if this is something new. And where I would like to start off with is it's not new at all. If you look back in trains, for instance, most of what we call diesel trains are not even diesel trains. The diesel generates electricity, and in fact, the drivetrain in that train, the engine, is an electrical engine anyway. So there is a lot of transportation, a lot of mobility that is around EV already as an engine there. And the reason being is because it's extremely efficient. It has very high torque at low rev. And if you look forward to passenger cars, it makes a hell of a lot of fun driving it. So it's nothing negative. It's, if you have ever driven an EV, there's always a big smile. I see your smile, Ben. There is this very nice experience that you get. And for anything else, it totally makes sense to have an electrical engine into your vehicle. So there is nothing new there. So let's not get any anxiety in this whole discussion about EV transition, something new. No, that's something that is very natural. So then, does this make sense? Yeah, it makes sense because of those two aspects, but it also makes sense, of course, because the emission goes down. Emission in terms of CO2, emission in terms of NOx. We all have that. We have Dieselgate, those kind of things. I don't think we have to go in detail there. So then, is this EV transition only about changing the engine? No, with changing the engine, you have to change the energy that feeds that engine as well. And then you get into energy production, energy distribution, and energy storage. And those three aspects are the main aspects in this transition. Yeah, it's not the engine itself. It is about the energy production. Because instead of getting fossil fuels out of the ground and make a fuel out of that you can use in a combustion engine, you have to do something else. And also there, by the way, you see some big benefits by this transition, because this whole fossil fuel thing, regardless that in the end, once you've used them up, you have these emissions. Even in the production, you have a lot of stuff that is rest or emitted or whatever. You know, just think about very nice things, which we thought were very nice things, like plastics. You know, 20, 30 years ago, you know, that was a big revolution, right? The plastics were great. It's a byproduct of this production of energy for combustion engines. Nowadays, we have a completely different opinion about plastics. So things change. You know, that's one thing to consider. Not something that we are involved in. I don't think something that we should be talking about too much today. But then you get to the next point, which is, okay, so you change the energy production from fuel to electrons. Energy then has to flow in a different way to your car. Again, be it the truck, be it the bus, or be it the passenger car, it doesn't matter. That distribution is associated with storage. Because back to trains, that distribution was almost immediate with no storage. If you look at the trains that run around now with the overhead lines where you feed the electricity into the trains, into the locomotives, you know, you can do that. Very difficult to move freely around in passenger cars and what have you. So you have to have a kind of storage in that car. And believe it or not, you know, one of the best things to have in a car is a battery. The energy density is high. The energy density over kilograms is high. So there is a lot to say about having a battery in a car, which has, by the way, at a certain moment in time, limitations in terms of how much you can store there. So there is a cutoff point where you would say, okay, this for passenger cars, for last mile delivery, for service fleet, for middle mile even, all makes sense to do batteries. Maybe for trucks, long haul, you do something else in the end. But let's focus here on fleet in the terms that I just defined. So that energy storage is then around battery, all great, but how do I get it distributed from production, where I use solar, wind, and what have you, into this battery? And now it becomes interesting. And that's where ChargePoint is also heavily involved over the past years, because we thought about this market in first instance, people that adopted the first EVs about, you know, I don't change my behavior. My mobility should exactly stay the same. I have a car or a fan or whatever I have, you know, there is energy stored in that car. I can do my mileage. And once the energy storage runs out, I go somewhere, get the new energy in, and start all over again. Yeah? Fueling up your car at a gas station. I want to go to a electricity dispensing station instead of fuel, and I want to have exactly the same behavior. Won't work. It's not smart. It is using the old way of doing in a new world. And that's, I think, where most of the changes occur in this EV adoption. It's not in the train, it's not even in energy production, because we will also, for any energy that we use in our homes, we want to get away from fossil fuels and into this new world. It's not even about distribution, but it's about getting the from the distribution into the storage, dispensing the energy. So having said that, what do you need to think about? You know, there were two things mentioned already earlier this morning, which is things like interoperability. I don't want, you know, to be stuck with certain brands or certain solutions. I still want to be free to move around. The nozzle of my fuel station should still fit in my car. Those kind of things. I should still be able to end up at any fuel station, in this case, a charging station, and be able to top up my car. And there were things said about smart grid. Smart grid now becomes the interesting bit, because that's where we transfer from physical world into the software world. And if there is anything that is needed for this EV adoption bit, is the whole software world, the software ecosystem surrounding this change. Because in the end, it's all about software. So just to take that potential misunderstanding away. If you look at our company, we are not a hardware manufacturer per se. We are mainly a software company, because all of this EV adoption, this industry, it pivots around software and software capability. So what then is the software doing for you in this case? Well, apart from airplanes, and we are not talking airplanes today, airplanes are achieving 90% plus usage per day. Yeah, if you look at the amount of hours that planes are in the air, it's really incredible. Even in a service delivery fleet, even in passenger cars, even in taxis, wherever you look, you will never get beyond 16 hours a day uptime. There will be always somewhere 6, 8, 12, up to 22 hours for normal commute situations. Cars are used for 2 hours a day max. They stand somewhere parked for 22 hours a day average, right? So how can you make use in a maximum efficient way of getting that energy into your car when the car is parked, with at the same time understanding that having the ability to move that car around or that fan around can be mission critical, for instance, again in delivery fleet. So that's where you get to, okay, I have to understand what the mileage is that this car, delivery fleet, fan, bus, truck has to do in the coming hours. When does it start? Where does it has to go to? What is the available energy dispensing from the grid connection that I have available? And how do I move maximum to the cars working ahead of what is needed? Don't wait till the battery is empty. Think ahead and start thinking about how do I get the energy properly distributed over all the batteries that I have so that I can do the mission critical part. Yeah. Then, because I run out of time, then back to the question that was for this panel. So how does that then influence also the EV adoption at consumers? Well, if you have that kind of thinking, you bring the infrastructure close to where the car is parked. So even in service delivery fleet, even in motor pool solutions, etc., you get the charging infrastructure close to where the car is parked, which means that in many instances you get it also close to where people live, because that's the logic. Because where people live, generally the cars are parked longest. Yeah. When you have that in place, you know, if you have a car which is owned by your employer, you can still use that infrastructure as well for private cars, consumer cars, your second car, etc. The only thing that you have to achieve again then is interoperability. Hey, we had that earlier. And secondly, the ability to charge the proper entity. Because for your private mileage, you need to be charged yourself. For your professional mileage, your employer has to be charged, or you have to be reimbursed, whatever way you look at it. So you have to know which session is which, you have to have this interoperability, and you have to be able to get this whole anxiety around your mission critical work to get that away. So I hope that all makes sense a little bit. I hope that has put it a little bit in a different perspective than what you normally get from a charging infrastructure company. Buy as many stations as you want. That's not what we are all about. So we think 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps ahead, and integrate with other parties as well to work together. Yeah, BMS, building management systems, you know, grid management systems, smart grid. You know, we are not alone in this world. It's about the energy dispensing. That's where we are at. It's not about the engines. It's not about production of energy. It's not even about getting the physical distribution lines in the ground. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, André. That was fascinating. Always useful to be reminded, I think, that even if it feels very new to those of us involved, people have been through transitions before, and there's lots that we can learn from trains and other things. I think also your framing of the software versus the hardware challenge is a great setup for us to bring in Aaron and the work that he's doing on electric miles, because I think there's a fascinating discussion for us to have about some of that behavioral change and how you can use software to really change the way that people interact with this infrastructure. So Aaron, I'll just give you a couple of minutes maybe to give an overview to the group on your work and the mission of Electric Miles.
Thank you, Chris. I'm so thrilled to join this elite panel and really enjoyed listening to you and your charge and the ChargePoint vision, André, especially your sentence around it's all about software. Totally agree. So we are the new kid in the block. So I'm the founder, CEO of Electric Miles, serial entrepreneur, an engineer over 15 years of in the energy sector. I mean, as you know, like EVs on the rise, and I was one of the early adopters. I've been driving an electric car for the last 3 years. I was like fascinated when EVs came on, got the traction. I was like, wow, this is going to be really interesting. The energy sector is going to meet automobile and transport, so 3 different sectors coming together. And the question, the big elephant in the room is, where are we going to find the clean energy? So that's why the idea of Electric Miles came in, and I was personally hit by sort of high electricity bills, charging my car, and was frustrated about when and how much to charge. And I thought surely the drivers are going to have the same issue. So I built sort of my own prototype on the back of my garage, and yeah, I'm proud to say that today we've launched this as Electric Miles. So we are a clean tech company. We are trying to build the sort of intelligent Internet of Energy electric vehicle charging solution. We connect EVs and home batteries with the sort of best computer intelligence to help user save cost, be efficient, and overall we're trying to reduce the overall energy use. So less is more. So we want UK to achieve the net zero target, and we definitely want us to be ready for the 2035 when new ICE ban will come through. We are here to put clean energy into your vehicles, and we want to bring the goalpost back to the whole reason why we're electrifying is about climate change and making sure our world is cleaner. And yeah, that's really the mission of Electric Miles. So we've been researching in this area over the last 2 years, and I completely agree with André said around we need to look at the bigger picture. This is not about how many cars can we sell, but this is about how we can deliver value to the drivers eventually in terms of either as a mobility as a service or charging as a service, and eventually like energy as a service. So yeah, so our platform is ready to launch for EV drivers and fleet operators, where we'll basically ensure you'll always have the right charge in your vehicle at the right time, at the right cost, and at the right carbon impact. So yeah, really excited about talking on the topic today.
Thank you very much, Aaron. And maybe just to finish us off on the panelists, then what role do you think the fleet operators play in that transition? So Aaron talked about personal ownership and fleet operators. This panel is really about us thinking about the fleet part of that and maybe the catalyzing role that they can play in that transition. So from your work, do you see any sort of specific opportunities for the fleets, or is it a more challenging transition for them?
No, thanks, Christopher. I think fleets have a really key role to play in the transition to EVs. Clearly, they have the buying power, first of all, to secure large numbers of EVs at cost-efficient rates. And then typically, if you look at a car rental fleet, most of those cars are then sold into the private sector within 9 to 12 months, sometimes 9 to 18 months. So it has a real opportunity to catalyse both second-hand market for electric vehicles and really to sort of figurehead the transition. As soon as you start introducing EVs into rental fleets or more broadly into fleets that are commonly seen on the road, it increases consumer confidence, which should again help catalyse the market. I suppose the key question around what and when do we transition in terms of the fleet? And that really comes down to 2 key elements. One is total cost of ownership. Does it make economic sense for a fleet operator to transition their fleet? And then the second element is how does that support the wider ESG position for those fleet operators? I'll take the second one first, actually, if you don't mind, because I think actually it's becoming such a key issue for corporations worldwide. Whether you're in local governments and you've made climate change commitments, you've declared climate change emergencies, and you're looking at how you decarbonise. So looking at grey fleets across carbons, across the carbon issues, or indeed you're a large operator. John Lewis, for example, had a fantastic presentation yesterday where we're starting to really think about our ESG credentials. And the transition to green fleets is not just about the air quality and the emissions piece here. It's about the wider true value, true economic value of that transition. So what can we do in terms of the wider benefits to the societies in which we're operating, the automotive sector itself, in terms of keeping people employed in job creation, in green mobility and green industries, which can then also catalyse for other elements of the energy system. I think that's really, really critical, and we've been doing a lot of thinking around that wider true value piece. It's not just the air quality or the carbon aspect of it, it's the wider economic benefits. I think the point about TCO is really important as well. For a number of vehicle classes now, we can see that TCO, total cost of ownership parity, is being met between EVs and ICE vehicles. Even in the bus market, which has traditionally been quite difficult, we realised this year, 2020, that there was cost parity for single-decker buses. And that cost parity, I suppose the challenge of the equation here is that typically people will just think about the vehicle, and it's not just the vehicle and the battery, the chassis and the battery. It's the whole life cycle of assets and capabilities you need. So it's the grid connection costs, it's the EV infrastructure costs, it's the skills and training that you need, it's the power purchase agreements that you need to have in place. And I think realistically, we are starting to see that across a number of vehicle classes, but not across all of them. There's also the question around, is it EV or is it hydrogen? And I think if we look at the HGV fleets and public service vehicle fleets, double-decker buses and rubbish collection vehicles, for example, there is still that question to be answered. And I don't think this is something that fleet operators are really not struggling with, but certainly having to consider at the moment. The other element of TCO, which I think it creates a bit of a circular challenge, is residual value. So we've got the residual value of the legacy fleet, which we've got to consider. And economically speaking, most operators won't want to retire the legacy fleet before they've been fully depreciated. It makes a lot of sense, unless there's unless there's a cost saving that can be made, or there's a clean air zone or other external drivers. But also the residual value for the EV fleet has not yet been fully established, so we don't have a second-hand market yet. So there is a chicken and egg thing that needs to be considered. But I think with the right strategy, both from a policy perspective for government and also the investment strategy from fleet operators, we have a real opportunity to catalyse the market with fleet operations.
Thank you, Ben. That's great. That's a really, really comprehensive view. We've actually got a couple of questions that are coming from the audience. I think my mic direct the first one straight back at you. So there's challenges there for the industry, there's challenges for government. There's also a challenge, I think, for us to tell a story about this transition and why we think it's important. The question is, what more needs to be done to really reinforce the climate change credentials of EV transition? You do occasionally see people write opinion pieces on how EVs aren't as clean as people would like you to believe. I mean, in the work that you're doing, what do you see as the core to really cementing and solidifying the message to the consumer at large and to bring that confidence that you described so that we can start to see mass adoption? Does industry have a role to play in that, do you think?
Yeah, undoubtedly. I suppose there's clearly the aspect of, several different considerations here. Thinking about the value chain for electric vehicles, we need to make sure that we are sourcing sustainably all the components for those vehicles. So that means thinking about the mining of lithium, cadmium, etc., and how we're getting that from sustainable sources without slavery and modern day slavery and other challenges. So we've seen corporations move to this over the last 5 to 10 years, but we really do need to be focusing on the EV supply chain, which is really good procurement governance to make sure that we've got that confidence in where we're sourcing materials from. We need to think about where we're constructing our assets and moving them about. So typically a lot of batteries are actually constructed in South America and Asia, and then shipped around the world on container ships, which obviously puts no carbon within that value chain. we need to really think about localizing where possible. And certainly there's an argument very much so for gigafactories in the UK as part of that. There's obviously the element about circular economy. So what do we do with the end-of-life assets, both the legacy fleet that we're retiring and also the EVs that we're buying? How do we make sure that those electric vehicles or fuel cell electric vehicles are built in a way that considers the end of life and recycling? And really critical within that is the battery itself. We're absolutely starting to see secondary and tertiary use cycles be established. Renault, for example, about 3 months ago announced that they were going to take batteries from their Zoes and put them in electric vehicle charging points for embedded storage. I think that's a fantastic demonstration of ESG credentials, but also protection of the residual value of the vehicle. So that, we need to be seeing more examples like that. And we also need to be then thinking about retiring those batteries and then decommissioning, recycling and reusing components as much as possible. That won't just sit with one party. It's not just going to be a fleet operator who says, I have to think about the whole end to end. Be responsible for the whole end to end. But they certainly need to think about that in their EV strategy, that whole value chain and how they do that sustainably. You need the procurers and operators of the vehicles to push for the right policy and informed policy, because they're actually out there doing it in practice and reality.
Thank you very much.
Can I add something to that, Christopher, if I may?
Of course.
Yeah, because we can only agree with all you said, Ben, and well phrased. What I would like to add there is, I also think we have to bring it a little bit closer to the consumer, the user, the driver of a fleet car, and what have you. Climate is a difficult thing, with everything going on in the world. Some world leaders even in denial. It's difficult to use that, as far as I'm concerned, as the main thing, but you can bring it closer. Due to COVID, I see a lot of delivery fleet vehicles in my street. Most of them are diesels, and I'm not particularly keen on the guys keeping the engine running, bringing something to my neighbor. I go out with the dog, I smell it. You can see it. You can see the knocks. You take that away immediately. That's a very important thing. So bring it close. What I mentioned earlier, the big smile when you drive an EV. Don't underestimate the additional benefit you get in driver experience by using one. It's a plus. It's not even, you don't avoid something negative, you get something positive. And the last thing to state here is, and we should make certain things more easy. One of the things in the UK particularly is the lack of roaming. We talked about plug and interoperability, but I can't still freely move around without having, a wallet full of charging cards to be able to access charging stations and what have you. That's mind-blowing. We have to get that away and make it visible to everybody that you can move freely around. You can charge everywhere you want, and there is no anxiety. And the very last thing is this whole grid anxiety thing that you mentioned as well. That's what we have to mitigate, because part of the cost, if you want to talk about TCO, if you don't do it in a smart way, one of the bigger drivers in your TCO, particularly in fleets, is your grid extension. To avoid the grid extension brings down your TCO considerably. So it's just a few bits and pieces that we really have to work on and get that in front of the fleet managers, in front of the consumers, and make that a more enjoyable and more positive experience, I would think.
Thank you, André. Aaron, anything to add on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think great points made again. So coming to like climate emergency, and again, the whole reason why we're doing electrifying, I think we also need to focus, this early effort needs to be focused on who are the biggest polluter on the road. Your last mile deliveries, your buses and the vans, but somehow the focus always gets shifted to the passenger vehicle. It's actually not your biggest polluter. So I think fleet vehicles account for something like 40% of total electric vehicle sales, but they actually account for 70% of air pollution. So because of the sort of size and pollution impact in the environment, they're actually a great candidate for this early adopter. And I think we should all come together to make sure fleet businesses are able to electrify. They are able to control their total cost of ownership. And at the same time, as André said, the challenges around grid stability, like are they that there is enough power for them to charge. So we at Electric Mass, like again, just through the power of software, we are looking at sort of fully automated this charge management. Again, you have like businesses, logistic businesses, and you have delivery companies, you've got Royal Mail, and all these companies, they are quite unaware of how this would work. So having a platform which can do it for them, kind of deciding which vehicle to charge when. And again, it's about living within our means. As André said, one of the biggest expense is actually not going to be buying those charge points. It's actually extending your grid capacity. For 100 kVA line, it costs about 60 to 80,000 pounds. Now, who are going to pay for this, right? So again, it's if we can manage within our means, ensure in the sense that do not charge 100% of your fleet, but actually charge based on your need. It should be data driven. It should be based on your schedule, your diaries, which driver is going out at what time, for how many miles, looking at the state of charge. So all of that, which we've been researching and sort of developing the platform, and to give that sort of continuous fleet monitoring, managing your dynamic and peak load, and then working with the DNOs and National Grid, where can we do V1G? You know, I know the industry get excited about vehicle to grid, which is few years down, but we can do V1G today, and we are looking to execute some of that this year. And again, fleets are great candidates. They got set pattern. They have less range anxiety. We know when they're going to be back in the depot. So we could actually use their energy to trade with the grid. And again, happy days, because grid will be happy that they're less constrained, and grid and your fleet operators, they're potentially to make some revenue. So I think we need to look at today as well. I mean, I'm a great believer of blue sky thinking, but also what can we do today because today is so important. If we're gonna get those numbers, we have to hit success today, right? So yeah, focus on the fleet and focus on the biggest polluter. Give them a practical solution which we can implement and deliver on it.
Great stuff. Okay, we have probably time for one or maybe two more questions from the audience. So, André, when you introduced us, you talked through the types of things that you felt were changing and weren't changing. You talked a little bit about how you couldn't have the behaviors of the old world in the new technology. So the question is, why not? Why can't we just turn petrol stations into battery swapping stations? Is there not a case to be made for standardization and to push the technology on that side? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you think that's a great idea or what the limitations might be.
There's two reasons for that, I would say. One reason is now, here and now. One reason is around the corner. The here and now reason is that we face camel behavior, as I would call it, in charging. Camel behavior, I mean, you know, if you look at the grid, from a grid perspective, you see that a lot of people commute in the morning and in the evening. So when you park your car, when you have an empty tank, so even look at the dispensing of liters of fossil fuels, you see that most of it is done in the morning, then a lot is nothing, and then a lot is done again during the commute in the evening. Charging is exactly the same, just half an hour later. So people arrive at the office, or people arrive at the fast chargers, connect, start charging, etc. So you can extend the number of fast chargers, which is very expensive and costly. And again, your grid connection is not capable of handling that. But even the grid is not, you know, very likely to handle those two peaks, those two camel bumps, if you want it. So there is a reason, a very simple reason, why you want to mitigate and get the peaks down. You can only get the peaks down if the cars are connected to the infrastructure for a longer period per day. So that's one thing. And then again, back to software, then you need the software to mitigate that. At least you get the mileage in, so the battery status to the level where you can do your mileage, and then you can freely move around again, where you can absolutely then, get the bumps flattened. V1G, Aaron was just referring to, helps there as well, but you can even go 2-3 steps further. Second reason, which is more around the corner, adding to V1G that Aaron was referring to, is V2G. So getting energy distributed between the batteries of your fleet. So you can have somebody coming in with a full battery, you can have somebody standing there with an empty battery, look at the grid connection, look at what the mileage should be done on that other delivery van, and you can actually use what is already in that battery to get it in your battery, to get the two being able to do the routing that they have to do. Is that far away? No, that's absolutely not far away. The technology is there. You can even do it on AC. You can do it on DC. So there's a lot of technology there that facilitates that already. Is that something that will work? For consumers, you see a lot of people thinking sharing of battery capacity or sharing of the energy that you have in batteries doesn't make that much sense. People will be hesitant. How do you get reimbursed for that, etc.? All true, and I must say, I thought exactly the same, or even worse, for mobile phones. Now, my kids have decided to buy a mobile phone that has the capacity to charge one phone by putting it on top of the other phone. V2G on telephones, mobile phones, and for them, it's completely natural. Just think a few years ahead, for them, doing that with cars will be completely natural. They do it today with phones. So it is something, the behavior will change faster than we actually ever expected, than I expected myself. So 2 reasons. One is the 2 bumps. Second reason, sharing the energy that's already in the battery.
Thank you, André. Ben or Aaron, any thoughts on why petrol stations can't become battery swapping stations? Ben, you're ready to offer.
I think it's an economics question at the end of the day. Well, sorry, it's an economics and a competition question at the end of the day. At the moment, batteries are fairly bespoke to the vehicles. It's and where the innovation goes is not the chassis anymore. We've had a race to the bottom on the chassis, and you only need to think about this from a perspective of I hate to use the word, Christopher, but the Uberization of transport. That you order an Uber now, you don't really care whether it's a Toyota or a Hyundai or whatever other vehicle. It's a black car or it's a grey car. You get in, and it takes you from one place to another, and that's had a material impact on the automotive section. You've already seen mergers and consolidation in the sector and streamlining of models. So we've got to the rate of the bottom on the chassis bit already. The innovation bit and the differentiation bit is in the battery. And there's a question for me around whether we're prepared to take that next step to say, actually, we want standardization of batteries. And by the way, it's not just the shape and the connection in it. It's also the characteristics of it from a charging perspective, from a power output perspective, from a heat perspective, from a safety perspective. I'd be surprised if governments went that far, if I'm honest, on the basis that actually there is still a bit of protectionism here with our own industries. So that's the first bit. I think the second bit is the economics of it, and Andre's already started talking about it, which is, if I charge, does it make sense as a personal EV driver? Probably not. No, because I drive nominally 95% of ranges within 25 miles. I can do most of my charging at home anyway. I'm not going to necessarily pay for a battery swap. That's a sort of very, very premium capability. And if my battery is not completely empty, do I get charged, pay to offset the cost of the residual charge and that, etc. Where I do think it makes sense, economically speaking, is in high yield fleets, where you may have a very, very, very short turnaround time of a high fleet, and where the cost of charging, as in the opportunity cost of charging for not having that vehicle out doing things, outweighs the cost of battery swaps and having incremental batteries in a stack somewhere. I think where this will really hit home is where we start fully seeing the rollout of autonomous vehicles. where we're no longer on the tacho, the driver doesn't need a loo break or a coffee break or something else, and we want to get 99.9% yield for that vehicle in a fleet, then it starts making more sense. But I don't think, because of that, I don't think it's going to end up at petrol stations on the side of the road. I think it's going to end up in depots and fleet centres.
Vision of the future there from Ben. Aaron, we've got a couple of minutes left. Any thoughts on battery swapping before we close?
Yeah, I mean, I know NIO in China have implemented this, but not a massive fan of this personally, because I think it brings in a lot of inefficiency, because you're creating a process after a process, right? So you got somebody doing up and down the country with the batteries in the wheel, and I don't think so the OEMs are ready for it as well. So I mean, the alternative is smart charging, and I think Philip, Ben, you interviewed Philip New. I mean, he made some great points around how important smart charging is. And again, we live in this. I mean, there's three biggest myths in this sort of EV adoption. One is range anxiety, but as we all know, 90% of our trips are less than 50 miles. And most of the vehicles have bigger than 50 miles battery. So as long as we are smart, we are charging more regularly. We need to move away from the petrol, diesel days of wait till the tank goes down and then charge up. That 80-20% charging is not the way forward. I think more sort of agile charging every day based on data, based on price, carbon, will solve that issue. And the other myth is not enough public charge points. Again, like there are more public charge points than there are petrol stations in the world, and obviously companies like ChargePoint have to you got to appreciate them for putting that sort of infrastructure. And again, 80% of charging happens at home or depot, and it's 3 times cheaper to charge at home and depot. Public charging should only be a top up, where nobody's going to go in and full tank their car in a public charge point, because they know they'll pay 3 times more, and possibly the energy might not be clean as well, because it's on demand rather than off peak. And the third one is the cost, where unfortunately not many of us have control over it. I mean, you just got to give it time. But however, there are still cheaper electric cars than there are ICE. I mean, Nissan have done some tremendous work, and even in the sort of van space as well. And you just got to give it time. And as technology grows, the prices are only going to fall. The choices are only going to get wider. And very soon, it's not the if, it's the when. When are companies going to electrify? So yeah, I think no for battery swapping, yes for smart charging.
A very pithy point on which to end. I think probably just leaves me to say thank you very much to the panelists. I think it's been great to have such a wide range of discussion, really great to cover the role of fleets and to be so positive. I think you often hear people talk about all of the things that are hard with this transition, but actually it's great to hear people talk about all of the reasons why it's possible and should happen, and the roles that we can all play in doing it. So thank you very much. I think we will now take another short break whilst we reshuffle the pack, and I'm sure Ben will be back with you for most of the rest of the day.
I will indeed. Thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the EV Infrastructure Summit. We're now going to the Keynote Panel 2, the UK's readiness to accommodate a fleet of 10 million electric vehicles. And we've got an all-star cast for you today, which Marcia will introduce in a second. But before we do that, I'll just quickly introduce Marcia, who's chairing and moderating the panel. Marcia is the Head of Customer Strategy and Policy at Kaluza. She brings a wealth of energy and policy experience, having spent over 20 years working on policies and strategies to enable the energy transition for regulators, businesses, and not-for-profit sectors. In her most recent role, Marcia was Director of Insights at the World Energy Council and led a team of global energy experts on unlocking opportunities related to the energy transition. Prior to that, Marcia worked for Sempra Energy in Los Angeles and was a policy advisor for California's energy regulator in San Francisco. Here, she was instrumental in their smart meter rollout and in the early regulatory work to help legitimize ride-sharing companies, including Uber and Lyft. In her new role as Kaluza's Head of Customer Policy and Strategy, Marcia will ensure that the consumer remains at the heart of the transition to a decarbonised energy system. Marcia has a degree in business and accounting from San Diego, California. And Marcia, it's very much over to you for the panel.
Thank you so much, Ben. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, panelists. Everybody, the audience, I'm joined by 4 wonderful experts who will share their thoughts on whether the UK is ready today, and if not today, what it will take for us to get ready. Before we get into the introductions, let me just first set the scene and do a quick walkthrough of how we will spend the next 45 to 50 minutes. So we will take about 10 to 15 minutes to set the scene from different angles. The AA will represent the drivers, while BP ChargeMaster brings to the conversation the need for charging infrastructure, and Energy Saving Trust will bring us their independent voice for low carbon transport. And finally, BVRLA, which is the trade association that represents rental, leasing, and fleet sectors, will give us their perspective on this transition away from petrol and diesel cars towards electric vehicles. I will then ask a number of questions, but what I'm hoping for is for the audience to ignore my questions and have their questions ready. Then I will go ahead and ask your questions rather than mine, but I have some in the back pocket just in case. The idea is that we will have, we will take about 35 minutes for Q&A. So whoever's out there, please ask your questions as the panelists begin to introduce themselves. And panelists, as you see the questions, please note that I get to ask them. So don't start answering questions until I get to ask them, just to keep things in line. With that, let's begin. We are here because we either have the answer or answers, or we're here because we want to know if someone else has the answer and whether that's right for the customer, for the UK customer. As the moderator, obviously, I will facilitate the discussion and give 95 to 99% of the time to our panelists, but I would be remiss if I didn't give my own answer. So I'll go ahead and do that and turn it over to you guys. Ben mentioned that I work at Kaluza. We are a technology company that is building the energy retail software platform that is, I like to think, friendly enough to engage all customers and cheap enough to keep customers happy with their suppliers who are powered by the software. One of the functionalities of this platform is our flexibility module, our Flex platform. To enable flexibility, we're partnering with leading companies to make their cars Kaluza enabled and or their chargers Kaluza ready, so that when their cars are sitting idle, our platform acts as an aggregator to shift demand to a time where the cost of electricity is at its lowest. And I'm talking about, obviously, flexibility. It is a buzzword, but it is also a real solution to keeping costs down and enabling the electric grid to take this incremental load created by 10 million EVs plugging into the system as forecasted by National Grid in 2030. So this is one solution. I'm keen to hear other solutions from our panelists, as well as maybe their thoughts on flexibility. The panel members include Edmund King, President of the AA, Tom Callow, Head of External Affairs, BP ChargeMaster, Ian Featherstone, Account Manager, Supply Chain Energy Saving Trust, and Catherine Bowen, Senior Policy Advisor, BVRLA. Thank you for giving us your time, panelists. Let's start with your perspectives. If we can start with Edmund, followed by Tom, Ian, and finally Catherine, that would be great. Then I'll ask some questions. So over to you, Edmund.
Great, thank you very much, Marcia, and thanks for Citi and Financial for putting on this amazing conference. I listened quite a bit yesterday and I've learned a lot already. So the exam question that you've set us is the UK's readiness to accommodate a fleet of 100 million EVs. That's a pretty radical question. But I think at the AA, I think we're ready. We've been around for 115 years. We've had to adapt to changing needs of the early automobilist to the current driver. And we have got some 3,000 patrols out there and they're ready. They are all trained to EV awareness level 2. Most of them have Tom's Polar cards in their pockets, so if people run out of charge, we can help them. We also are adapting our business to help EV drivers. So my colleague Dean Hedger is out there virtually in this conference, and Dean is working with ChargePoint providers to offer that service. If the customer doesn't know how the ChargePoint works, we've got experts who can help them. We've got call centers that are experts. We're also looking at field technicians that could go out there. But I think the most important thing, and Marcia, you alluded to this, the most important thing in all of this is the consumer. It is the customer. We need to know what they want. We need to know what their worries are, and we need to help them overcoming it. But I think there's some really positive news, really good news, really radical news. Our latest survey with the Populous panel of over 17,000 drivers that we did for a ITV Tonight program, and that was called Electric Cars, Are We Ready? Well, the top line finding of that was that 47% of drivers out there say that they will consider an electric car for their next purchase. So that is really radical. That gives us hope. And yes, there are lots of things that we need to do to go along the way to reassure them, and I'm sure Tom and others on the panel will refer to that. But I think the good news is the consumer is now at a stage when they're ready to go out there and buy cars, and it's our jobs to help them. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Tom? Tom, over to you. I think Tom is frozen. So while Tom unfreezes, let's go to Ian.
Thank you, Marcia. So I work for Energy Saving Trust, and as an organisation, we've been engaged in this area for about 10 years. So we've seen quite a lot of changes over that time. One of the main features of the work we do is working with the vehicle fleets. And I guess 10 years ago, most of that work was helping fleets operate diesel, petrol vehicles more efficiently, choosing the right vehicles and driving them properly, and putting the right policies in place to encourage lower emitting vehicle use. Now that same team who work with fleets, nearly all of their work features electric vehicles. So we're helping fleets of all sizes to really get their head around how they're going to put these vehicles on the road. And I think, you know, I'd echo Edmund's view that, you know, fleets are adapting to the new world. We also work quite extensively with local authorities to help them deliver strategies to improve air quality, which is really where our engagement with local authorities started a couple of years ago, and ULEV adoption. And you know, we'll help them put local strategies in place for public charging infrastructure, implementing ULEV taxi policy, training their own staff, and helping them develop new build housing guidance for ChargePoint installation. And I guess one area which is really important, because we work very much with the whole vehicle supply chain, and the number of points in the supply chain that electric vehicles impact, and Edmund mentioned the repair and maintenance of vehicles as one, but the whole industry is impacted. So we've done an awful lot of training with used car dealers, with car dealer groups, with motor auctions, leasing brokers, and really anyone else in the industry who will engage with us to try and get the industry ready for the large scale, the 10 million electric vehicles by 2030. And we also help by delivering an audit process for the National Franchise Dealers Association. They have an EVA, electric vehicle approved kite mark scheme for car dealers, so we provide an audit process on that as well.
Great, thank you so much. Catherine, how are we gonna bring forward the leasing, rental, and fleet sectors into electrification?
Thanks, Marzia. So as Marzia said, I'm Senior Policy Advisor at the BVRLA. I lead on air quality, future mobility and decarbonisation. To give a bit of context, BVRLA members operate 5 million vehicles on the UK's roads. That's 1 in 8 cars, 1 in 5 vans and 1 in 4 trucks. Our members purchase 50% of all new vehicles that are registered in the UK per annum. And currently that includes 80% of all battery electric vehicles. Earlier this week, we announced a revised plug-in pledge, which really shows that this is set to continue. And by 2025, the vehicle renting, leasing and fleet industry will be registering 400,000 battery electric cars and vans each year. And in terms of the total fleet, the industry will own and operate 75% of battery electric vehicles on the UK's roads, around 900,000 vehicles by 2025. So we recognise we've got a really critical role to play in terms of moving people to zero emission transport, whether that's via both the new but also the used car market. So because of the regularity of fleet cycles from our members, we can put those EVs onto the market a lot quicker. And some of the main challenges facing our sector include the supply of vehicles, obviously the demand, making sure that there are incentives, but arguably the biggest challenge is infrastructure. And our members' needs, I guess, differ significantly when it comes to infrastructure. So we've got customers who will charge at home, at depot, back to base if they're rental operators, and also while on the road. But there are also a large number of fleet operators whose employees take vehicles home, but they won't have the ability to charge those vehicles at home because they don't have a driveway. So reliance on public infrastructure is going to be really important. And we need to ensure that there's adequate provision of public charging infrastructure, and ongoing concerns with things like payment and maintenance standards are quickly overcome. But also that it's as simple and as cost effective to charge up as it is to fill up. I think that's absolutely imperative. And then to ensure greater customer confidence, we'd like to see Project Rapid extended. So it goes beyond just the strategic road network to include things like travel hubs, but also that it comes outside of our towns and city centres so that there's more rural provision as well. And then one of our main sort of concerns relates to the grid upgrade process and the fact that this is inherently unfair, that it's the one that pushes the grid over capacity that is the one that has the whole cost. And it was good to hear Ofgem giving the update that they gave yesterday, but we recognise that any change is going to take time. So I think it's really important to ensure that there are funds and support in place for those who are looking to put that infrastructure in ahead of time, especially if they are going to accelerate the uptake of EVs and if we are going to meet the new phase out targets once they're announced. And I guess the final point I'd like to make is this is a whole new world for many fleet owners and operators. So they've never had to engage with the energy sector before. So we've been working quite closely with government over the past couple of months to look at how we can help fleets navigate this process. So pointing to the right part on the DNO's website, making sure that there's simplicity and consistency of language, that there's a process map that helps them navigate what they've got to do, and understanding where they can get help and who they need to talk to. So that's a bit of an introduction from me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I, as you were talking, in my head, I was going, I need to get to know this woman. 5 million EVs, but we need to make those Kaluza enabled. So I'm going to talk to you after this session. Is Tom joining us? I think you had some difficulty. Tom, are you back on?
Yeah, I'm back on. Sorry for dropping off. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
So yeah, my name is Tom Callow, Head of External Affairs, BP ChargeMaster, one of the sort of largest companies in the UK from a perspective of both deploying charging infrastructure. We manufacture charging points in the UK, but also operating public charging. And from our perspective, one question I often get asked is, are we ready today? Well, of course, we're not ready for 2030 or 2040 today. It wouldn't make much sense from an infrastructure point of view to have infrastructure in the ground 10 years ahead of time and not being used. It would get sort of neglected clearly. But I think we will be ready. And I outside of my day job, I sit on the trustee board at the National Motor Museum down in Bewley, and there's I'm interested in that kind of automotive history element. And there's a huge number of parallels with the early days of petrol cars, particularly in the UK when it comes to EV charging. And the same doubts that people have today about electric cars, they were still there in the early days of internal combustion engines, and people wondering whether they would ever take off, how they would be used, where petrol stations would be, would people have to go around buying petroleum spirit in glass bottles for the rest of their lives, etc. So lots of those same parallels exist. One of the key things I think that we have to understand with infrastructure around electric vehicles is that it's going to be different and it's going to be varied across different sort of use cases. And it's not the case that people will simply, or everyone will fill up in the same way they do to a car, for example. We have a situation, obviously, where there's a mix of infrastructure. So we have home charging, workplace charging, public charging, and so on. But we also have the situation where there is ultra fast charging, for example, on forecourts as well. So the differences that electric vehicles bring is something that needs to be embraced and not sort of they are different from ICEs, and that's a good thing.
I think we're losing you.
We have to right-size the infrastructure based on use cases. So there will be people that only ever charge at home, for example. They never need public charging, and we have to kind of understand that and appreciate that they won't be necessarily part of the public charging equation. And as Edmund says quite rightly, that this all comes back to the consumer and the customer. So for us, there's no point in building infrastructure if it's not used, if there's not customers there to use it. So we have to carry on with them as a focus area and make sure that the infrastructure is right for them. And we're doing
your connection
work in terms of accessibility. Will be accessible without having to. Apologies. Let me keep trying. But all public charging points will have to be accessible.
It's strange. As soon as I say your connection is bad, then the connection clears up. So I think we lost Tom. While we get him back, a question for you guys. It is all about the customer, and first impressions are huge when it comes to a new technology or a new way of thinking. And it seems as though, just listening to you, Edmund and Catherine, basically you guys cover all the drivers in the UK if you put the two together. How do you promote electric vehicles to your members, or do you?
Yeah, if I could take that. One of the things we do, we talk to our members often. So we have this AA Populist panel. It's a database of over 200,000 drivers. It's the biggest dedicated motoring panel in Europe. And every month we go to them with questions. So we have actually been tracking drivers' views about electric vehicles. And what are the things that drivers say is stopping them buying vehicles. Now, many of these things might not be true, but if they are a perception, we've got to overcome that. So in our last survey, when we actually asked what are the reasons for not buying an EV, 69% said lack of public charging points. But as Tom alluded to be quite honest, that is a bit of a myth, because as we heard, 80% of people would charge at home, and that the charging points are there for topping up, etc. The second one was 67% said the new car, the new EV, is too expensive. And that probably was the case a few years ago, but actually the prices are coming down, the cars are getting better, they're becoming more affordable, the range is getting better. And the third was 66% still talk about this so-called range anxiety. But again, quite often it's for that one trip to the Lake District that they do once a year, and that for the vast majority of journeys are relatively close to home or commuting. So really part of our role is to overcome those myths. So by using the media, so this ITV program that we were involved with, talking to the media, actually putting more information on the AA website, getting our patrols up to speed so that when they talk to customers, they've got more knowledge of EVs. And I do think it's important that we bring those consumers with us, because Catherine's cars and buying them for fleets is brilliant, but then when they go onto the used car market, that is our role to kind of educate drivers. And we do have a site, AA Cars, where you can buy used cars, and there is an EV section there, and interest in that is growing daily. So I think it's about communicating, simplifying things, and getting those messages across.
Catherine, do you promote EVs with your members, or is it more that you guys are a unbiased membership?
So I think the changes to the benefit in kind tax system have made a massive difference. So that really has encouraged a lot of company car drivers to now consider an electric vehicle, which is a great thing, because those vehicles in 3-4 years' time will then be available on the second-hand market. I think, you know, as Edmund said, I think it's that whole communication piece that's really important. I think in-life incentives are absolutely critical. So even with the second hand, you know, the cost of an electric vehicle is going to be more expensive than its sized equivalent. So we need to find other ways to incentivize people to take them. And I think, you know, that there need to be incentives in place that encourage people to do that. But I think, and it's a question, I guess, as much as it is an answer, I think education is really important. We've heard a lot about charging, and it's going to take a sort of change in mindset. I mean, I know I run my petrol vehicle right down until it's nearly empty before I fill it right up. So, you know, it's going to take a whole change in mindset. And I guess the question to the panel would be, who's responsible for that education, and how do we work together to sort of promote that messaging and to change that mindset?
I think, Ian, that's a question for you. And on top of Catherine's question, I want to add to her question to say, Edmund mentioned earlier that 47%, based on their survey, AA's survey, 47% of potential drivers are willing to look into an EV. Is that a good number at this stage? Or should we be at 90% right now? So if you could answer both, that would be great.
Yeah, I think when we go back several years, there was a feeling that the EVs would have expanded exponentially a few years ago, and the whole market. Now that hasn't happened. It's been a gradual development, and in some ways that's positive, because it's meant that there haven't been gluts of less capable EVs creating very poor resale values. There haven't been unused vehicles, etc. So I think, you know, when you look at people's perceptions of them, 47% is pretty high. That would be 15 million cars on the road if everybody bought one the next time they went out in over a few years' time. So I think from our point of view, certainly in terms of education, most of our work is funded by Department for Transport and Transport Scotland. And one area that we work in is addressing aspects of market failure. So, for example, looking at the used vehicle sector, going back 3 or 4 years ago, some EVs in the auction system weren't achieving very high values at all. And part of the problem was that the trade didn't understand the vehicles, either the people auctioning them or the used car traders buying them. So that's why we basically launched a program to kickstart the training of used car dealers so that they could understand the vehicles and they knew not only just the their capabilities in terms of selling them, but also that they could understand the different potential battery sizes in a car that looked very much the same. And the official documentation, the vehicle registration document, just says electric vehicle. Doesn't tell you how big the battery is, how fast the vehicle will charge, what its power consumption is, etc. So, they had to think about things very differently there. And I think the education thing is extremely important. And even when we engage with potentially quite large businesses who come to us basically for us to help them reset their policies and start to work through and start putting vehicles on the road, really the first conversation we tend to have with them is to establish a base point, just to ensure that they're up to date with where the industry is now, both in terms of charging, but also in terms of the vehicle technologies, because it's such a fast moving industry. If you forget about it for 6 months, you're way out of date.
So Tom is back, and I think his connection is more stable. So I'm gonna address this question to you, Tom, but others please feel free to chime in. So we have gas stations, or we have gas stations because with petrol and diesel, these fuels aren't readily available at home. You have to go to a gas station to refill your car. But with an EV, we can plug in at home. So Tom, do we need as many charging stations as we have gas stations today?
I think it's a slightly kind of false way of looking at it, in my view, in terms of looking at gas stations and trying to kind of make an equivalence between the two, because they're very different technologies. So my general answer to how many charging points we're going to need in future public charging points is we're going to need a lot more than we have today, but we're not going to need as many as most people think. So there were some sort of fairly ludicrous numbers being bandied around in the last few months about needing 3 million charging points by 2040 or something, public charging points on street. That's clearly not going to be needed. We're not going to need a 1-to-10 ratio of public charging points to vehicles, for example. You're right, obviously a lot of people can charge at home, but a lot of people can't, and it's really important that we remember the people that can't, because they're a much harder market for all of us to sort of solve the EV sort of challenge for than people with home charging. If you have access to home charging, even if you're a very high mileage sort of fleet driver, and I've done sort of 40,000 miles a year, I've done 35,000 miles a year in a pure electric car, for example, quite happily, with most of that being done at home. If you've got home charging, it's very easy to own and drive an EV, even if you're a high mileage driver. If you don't have access to home charging, it does become more challenging, but certainly not impossible. We have some of our customers are getting 40,000-50,000 miles a year just off public charging on our network alone, before you consider that they might be using others. So we're not going to need as many, but it's certainly going to be sort of in the 6 figures, in my view, somewhere, probably not in millions of public charging points. And the blend is going to be important too. So, for people who don't have access to home charging, it may well be more convenient for many of those people to go and charge quickly, maybe once a fortnight somewhere, rather than then trying to sort of, have a bit of a bun fight over a local on-street charging point, for example, with sort of hundreds of their neighbours. So it might fit better use cases where you have that fast charging available. So we certainly see a growing space of ultra-fast charging that enables you to get something like about 100 miles of range in about 10 minutes with today's technologies. And to give you a comparison, I mean, Catherine is obviously quite unusual, and she lets her tank go down to nearly empty. Most people don't do that in a petrol diesel car. And the average fill up on a forecourt is actually about 20 litres, and the average dwell time is about 7 minutes. So 20 litres gives you about 200 miles of range, and that's about 7 minutes of average dwell time today. So EV charging is already in this nascent market at about 100 miles in 10 minutes of capability. You know, we're not actually a million miles off what most people are experiencing in forecourt filling. You know, yes, you can get 800 miles in a tank in a couple of minutes, but most people don't, and that's what we need to think. The data is really important in this space.
Yeah. Okay. Others? Any addition to that?
I mean, just one from quite an interesting from a breakdown point of view. So currently, with petrol and diesel cars, about 1% of our breakdowns are those cars running out of fuel. With electric cars, it is actually slightly higher, but relatively low. It's about 4%, down from about